The myth we so wanted to believe. Imagine June 1941, early morning. The sun is rising over the border, but its light will soon be dimmed by the smoke of thousands of fires. A war is coming, not the one they prepared for, not the one they planned. This is a catastrophe, terrible, bloody, relentless. And right in the middle of this hell, it stands, the steel symbol of the coming victory, the legend born on the drawing boards in Kharkov, the T-34 tank. We've all heard this fairy tale since childhood. The best tank of the Second World War, the weapon that turned the tide of the war, the invincible machine the Germans feared like fire. But what if I told you that's only half the truth? What if the most bitter, the most terrible part of the story is hidden behind the gloss of victory parades? Then why, in 1941, when the Red Army had thousands of these invincible machines, did German divisions cover hundreds of kilometers in just weeks, surrounding and destroying entire armies? Where were these steel giants looking? Why didn't they stop the enemy? The answer to this question isn't in tables of numbers, not in dry technical specifications. It's in the people, in the chaos of command, in the systemic lie, in the giant state machine that first created a myth and then threw it against the harsh reality of war. This is not a story about why the T-34 was bad. This is a story about why even the most fearsome sword is useless in the hands of a blind, deaf, and bound warrior. Ready to learn the truth? Then let's look behind the curtain of the legend. The armor that wasn't invincible. Shattering the main myth. Emotional hook. He sat in the cramped oil and sweat-stained turret, choking on gunpowder fumes. Through the narrow slit of the sight, he saw gray figures crawling out of the forest. They can't pierce us, he whispered to himself, remembering the political officer's words. He believed in his machine like it was a god. And then came the blow, not loud, like someone throwing a rock into an empty barrel. Something hot and sharp pierced his leg. The last thing he saw was a crimson flower blooming on the armor next to him. His armor, his invincible armor, had betrayed him. The legend of the complete invincibility of the T-34 is perhaps the most persistent myth. It's been repeated in movies, books, and veteran stories, as if German shells bounced off its sloped armor like peas off a wall. Was that really the case? Let's break it down like ordinary people. Imagine a car. Let's say it has very strong front doors, but the hood, the roof, the rear fenders are made of much thinner metal. Would such a car be invincible? Of course not. You just have to hit the weak spots, not the strong ones. It was the same with the T-34. Its front hull armor, that famous sloped one, 45 millimeters thick but set at a smart angle, was indeed a tough nut for the standard German 37 millimeter anti-tank gun. The Wehrmacht soldiers called it a door knocker because it was useless against our tanks. That is true. But here lies the first lie. War is not a one-on-one duel in an open field. It's a dirty, bloody close-quarters fight in forests, on roads, in villages. The Germans weren't suicidal. They didn't charge head-on. They hit from the flanks, from the rear, from ambushes. Now, look at the T-34 through their eyes. Its turret, the very one housing the commander, the gunner, and the loader. Its sides are vertical steel plates, the same 45 millimeter, but with no slope at all. Essentially, it's a straight, almost vertical wall, and it was easily penetrated not only by new German guns, but also by those same door knockers at close range. What about the side of the hull? Yes, it was sloped too, but much more gently, and its thickness was its Achilles heel. Already in the spring of 1941, before the war, during our own proving ground tests, a shocking fact was discovered. Standard German armor-piercing shells of 37 and 50 millimeter caliber confidently penetrated the side and turret of the T-34 from a distance of 200 to 300 meters. Imagine, just 200 meters less than the length of 2 football fields. In real combat, this distance was considered negligible. Economic background and analysis. Now let's step away from tactics and look at the economy. Why was the turret like that? The answer is terrible and simple. Speed and cost. Producing a cast turret of a complex, streamlined shape with rational angles of slope on all sides is a tremendously difficult technological task. It requires different machines, different molds, more time. And in the USSR of the late 30s, there was one task: to give the army as many tanks as possible and as cheaply as possible. The country was not rich. Industrialization was in full swing. The choice between an ideal tank and a mass-produced one was made in favor of mass production. A turret of a simple, boxy shape was more technologically advanced and faster to produce. The crews paid for this with their blood in the summer of '41. So the first myth is shattered. The T-34 was not invincible. It was well protected from the front, but vulnerable from the sides. And in war, as in a fight, the opponent always hits the weakest spot, not just door knockers. Who the T-34 really faced in 1941. Emotional hook. Lieutenant Petrov looked through his periscope at the approaching silhouettes. More of these midgets, he smirked, meaning the light PZ-IEs. His platoon of 3 T-34s was the king of the field. Suddenly, from the flank, from behind a burning farm, a shower of sparks erupted. One of his tanks jerked and stopped. A second shot, and another one. Petrov didn't understand. From where? He couldn't see the enemy, and the enemy, hiding behind the buildings, was methodically, like at a shooting range, picking off his blind and clumsy machines. If the only problem had been the outdated 37mm guns, history might have gone differently. But the German Wehrmacht by June 22, 1941, was far from the naive opponent it's often portrayed as. While we were building thousands of T-34s, the Germans did their homework. They learned from the experience in France, where they encountered well-armored French and British tanks, and they found an answer. The main threat to our medium tank came not from its direct counterpart, but from the upgraded PZ, KPFW-3, of which there were already over 1,090 units by the start of the war. Many of them were equipped with a new, long-barreled 50mm gun, the WWII 38-liter 42. What did this mean in practice? If the 37mm was a door knocker, this gun was a serious fist. It guaranteed penetration of both the front of the turret and the side of the T-34 at ranges of up to 500 to 700 meters. This was no longer close combat distance. This was a respectable range, at which our tank, with its imperfect sight, had trouble seeing the target. But that's not all. The Germans thought in terms of systems. Their tanks weren't just steel boxes with guns. They were nodes in a complex combat machine. The tank commander had an excellent panoramic cupola, allowing him a full view of the battlefield. The gunner had high-quality optical sights. And most importantly, radios were installed in almost all command tanks and many regular ones. Imagine the situation. A German tank platoon is 3 or 4 machines that can hear each other. They, like a pack of wolves, can coordinate their actions. The commander sees our T-34, which is facing him head-on. He gives a command over the radio to 2 other tanks. Flank right, hit the side. And while our crew, gasping in the cramped, smoky space, tries to manually traverse the heavy turret towards the main threat, those 50mm shells are already hitting from the flank, and hitting accurately. Our tank, in most cases, was deaf and blind. A radio was only in the command vehicle, and even that was unreliable. The other tanks in the platoon acted on the do as I do principle. They watched the commander's flags. In battle, in dust and smoke, it was impossible to see these flags. The result was not a coordinated pack, but a group of individuals whom a smart and organized opponent picked off one by one. My opinion and analysis. This is where we get to the key point. War is not a comparison of 2 smartphones by their specs. It's a comparison of 2 systems. The German tank crew communication tactics system was, at that time, much more refined and effective than ours. They had been fighting for 2 years in Europe. They had been through the school of real combat. We were only learning, and the price for this tuition was monstrously high. The Germans didn't hit with the most technological weapon, but with the most effective one, at that time their organization. The real killer of the T-34. Not tanks, but guns. Emotional hook. They never saw who killed them. First, there was just a loud bang somewhere ahead. Then a deafening blow to the turret. Inside, everything went dark. The driver, Senior Sergeant Ivanov, was deafened for a moment. When he came to, he realized the tank wasn't moving. He tried to reverse nothing. The turret was jammed. Acrid smoke was coming from the driver's compartment. He was alive, but his tank, his formidable T-34, was dead, killed by one precise hit from a distance from which he hadn't even seen the enemy. If you still think the main killers of the T-34 were German tanks, you are mistaken. The most terrible, the most inevitable threat came from German artillery. The Germans elevated the use of artillery to an absolute, to an art form. They didn't hesitate to use everything that could shoot against our tanks. Take, for example, the standard 105mm field howitzer. You might think, what use is it against a tank? It's simple. It didn't need to penetrate the armor. A hit from a powerful high-explosive shell near the tank was like a blow from a giant blacksmith's hammer. It could flip it over, concuss the crew. A shell hitting the running gear turned it into a pile of scrap metal. The tank lost mobility and became a stationary target. The gun, the sights were damaged. The tank was disabled even if its armor remained intact. But the real nightmare, the weapon that sowed terror, was the famous 88, the 88mm flak anti-aircraft gun. The Germans quickly realized that this gun, with its phenomenal muzzle velocity, was the ideal anti-tank weapon. Let's visualize it. Our T-34 approaches the edge of a forest. In front of it is a field, 1.5 kilometers wide. Somewhere on the other side, well camouflaged, sits an 88. For its crew, our tank's armor was no serious obstacle. It could pierce a T-34 straight through at a distance of over 1.5 kilometers. Now remember, the effective firing range of our F-34 tank gun against tanks was about 500 to 600 meters. A terrible disproportion resulted. The German could calmly shoot our tanks, remaining in complete safety, outside the range of our return fire. What could the crew do in this situation? Almost nothing. They couldn't see the enemy. They didn't know where to expect the blow from. They were a blind mole, being killed from a great distance by a sniper. Economic and industrial analysis. Now the question, why didn't we have anything similar? The answer again comes down to economics and doctrine. Soviet military thought bet on a mass-produced, relatively cheap tank for deep breakthroughs. The task of fighting enemy tanks from extreme distances wasn't a priority. Moreover, the production of such high-tech and expensive guns as the German 88mm required the highest production standards and enormous resources. Our resources were spent on quantitative growth. The Germans, with limited resources, bet on quality and versatility of key systems. They couldn't build more tanks than us, so they built a system where one of their guns could destroy dozens of our tanks. And this system worked with terrifying efficiency in 1941. The blind and the deaf. The tragedy of the crew. Emotional hook. The tank commander, Junior Lieutenant Kozlov, felt like a cobbler who had to nail on a sole and stitch a boot shaft at the same time. He had to command the crew, watch the battlefield, give orders to the driver, and at the same time, aim the gun and fire. A deafening roar filled his ears. His eyes swam with circles from the strain. He frantically turned his head, trying to spot the enemy through the tiny, mud-spattered viewing slits. He didn't see that to the side, 200 meters away, a German gun was already deploying. He was too busy. He was one man in hell who had to do the work of three. The greatest injustice towards the crews of the early T-34 was not even the armor or the armament, but the conditions they worked in. The tank's design, in essence, fought against them. Imagine the turret. It was designed for 2 people, but it had to hold 3: commander, gunner, and loader. The commander was a universal soldier. He was the commander, but he was also the gunner. While he was trying to assess the battlefield, evaluate the situation, give orders to the driver, he simultaneously had to aim and fire. This is absurd! It's like asking a surgeon performing a complex operation to also be the anesthetist and the nurse. The quality of each task inevitably drops. Now about the tank's vision. The viewing devices of the T-34 were archaic. They were narrow slits, protected by glass blocks that easily got dirty, fogged up, and provided a pitifully small field of view. A German tanker, leaning out of his command cupola, saw the entire battlefield as if in the palm of his hand. Our commander saw the world through several sooty, shaking keyholes. What did this mean in practice? The German platoon always saw ours first. The German commander always had time to command retreat or left into cover, while ours was still figuring out where the threat was coming from. In battle, seconds decide everything, and our crews lost these seconds, being blind and overloaded. My opinion. When I read about this, I'm filled with a sense of anger and bitter pity. These guys, these 19-year-old boys, went into battle in a machine that was brilliant in concept, but raw and poorly thought out in its details. They were thrown into the meat grinder without being given the main thing, the ability to see, hear, and act in a coordinated manner. They died not because they were bad soldiers. They died because their heroism was not supported by competent engineering and thoughtful organization. The state demanded feats from them, but did not give them adequate tools for it. Chaos instead of command. How entire corps perished. Emotional hook. Major General Katskilevich, commander of the 6th Mechanized Corps, crumpled another radio message from the front headquarters in despair. He was ordered to immediately counterattack in a new direction. The problem was, he didn't know where 2 of his 3 divisions were right now. His communication with them had been broken for 2 days. He didn't know how many tanks he had left, how much fuel, how many shells. He looked at the exhausted face of his chief of staff. Again blind, he said quietly, and gave the order, dooming tens of thousands of people to a march into nowhere. If the problems with the tanks were tactical, The problems with command were operational and strategic. It was a real collapse, a systemic failure on a monstrous scale. Take that very 6th Mechanized Corps, often cited as an example. This is a textbook story of how armies perish not by the hand of the enemy, but by their own impotence. The Corps was one of the most powerful in the Red Army. It had over 1,000 tanks, including the newest KVs and T-34s. It was a steel sledgehammer capable of crushing any German division. But what happened to it? Even before the start of active fighting, the Corps was raised on alert and began to be moved around aimlessly. Then hell began. The front and army headquarters, themselves not understanding the situation, showered them with contradictory orders. One day, the Corps was ordered to go north, the next day south, the day after return to its old positions. Imagine this picture. Thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of people moving along the roads of Belarus. They have no clear goal. They have no reliable communication with each other. They don't conduct reconnaissance. They just march. And in the sky above them, German aviation, which sees this giant, slow-moving target as if on the palm of their hand. The Corps was not defeated in a general battle. It was defeated in parts. Columns of tanks and trucks were bombed from the air, shelled by artillery from the flanks. Machines broke down. Fuel ran out. Crews, without engaging in battle, abandoned their vehicles due to breakdowns or lack of fuel. Logistical catastrophe. Take another example, the 12th Tank Division. It marched 415 kilometers before its first serious battle. What happens to a tank after such a march? The running gear breaks, engines fail, tracks wear out. The division went into battle at half strength, with exhausted crews and equipment on the verge of falling apart. Its combat potential was wasted on these senseless marches. This wasn't war. This was suicide. The giant, clumsy mechanized corps, created for deep breakthroughs, turned out to be completely unmanageable in the conditions of chaos, panic, and loss of communication that reigned in the first weeks of the war. The Germans hit them not with numbers, but with skill with their famous Kesselschlacht, Battle of Encirclement, cutting off, surrounding, and destroying the leaderless Soviet units. The final chord, without infantry or reconnaissance. Emotional hook. Captain Smirnov's tank company was stuck in the black, viscous mire up to its axles. Several vehicles, trying to bypass, had left the causeway and were now helplessly spinning their tracks, sinking deeper. The first shells hit from the direction of the forest. Smirnov understood. They had walked into a trap. They had attacked without reconnaissance, blind. The infantry that was supposed to follow them had fallen behind and was pinned down by fire. Now, they were just targets. The Germans, unhurriedly, rolled their guns out for direct fire and began a methodical shootout. The final nail in the coffin of the tank units in the summer of '41 was the complete lack of interaction between military branches. Tanks were thrown into attacks without infantry support, without artillery preparation, without engineering reconnaissance of the terrain. A prime example is the fighting near Nemirov. The 8th Tank Division received an order to attack. The tanks went forward without waiting for the infantry. They entered a swampy area that would later be called the peat bog in reports. Dozens of vehicles, including heavy KVs, got stuck in the quagmire. They could move neither forward nor backward. And what did the Germans do? They didn't throw their tanks into a head-on attack. They simply brought up their artillery. 105mm howitzers fired at the immobilized Soviet tanks with direct fire, like in a shooting gallery. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. The crews were forced to either surrender or try to blow up their vehicles and break through the swamps to their own lines. The heroism of individual soldiers and commanders could not compensate for the monstrous miscalculations of the command. Bitter lessons and the birth of a true legend. So why didn't the T-34 save them in 1941? The answer is now obvious. It didn't save them because one tank, even the best one, cannot win a war. A war is won by a system, a coordinated, well-oiled, manageable one. And the Soviet military system in June '41 was sick. It was afflicted by a virus of senseless doctrines, purges that destroyed the flower of the command staff, gigantomania, unpreparedness for real war, and terrible organizational chaos. The T-34 was a formidable weapon, but it was placed in the hands of an inexperienced, poorly trained, and, most importantly, blind and deaf giant. While this giant was helplessly swinging his sword, a clever and experienced opponent was methodically striking him in his most vulnerable spots. The main lesson of 1941 is not that our tanks were bad. It is that combat effectiveness is determined not by superiority in tables of technical characteristics, but by superiority in command, communication, logistics, crew training, and competent interaction of all military branches. The T-34 became a legend later, in the autumn of that terrible year, when the giant, clumsy mechanized corps were disbanded. They were replaced by more mobile and manageable tank brigades, when radios started arriving in the troops. When commanders, tempered in the crucible of retreat, learned on their own skin what real war was. When pre-war dogmas were replaced by harsh and bloody experience. The T-34 became a truly fearsome weapon when the Red Army learned to use it competently, when the system finally caught up and began to service its main tool. Therefore, when you are shown numbers about thousands of tanks on June 22nd and they say, "How could we have lost?" you now know the answer. War is not arithmetic. It is the higher mathematics of strategy, tactics, logistics, and the human spirit. And in 1941, our country was just beginning to comprehend this terrible and complex science at the cost of millions of lives. Friends, our investigation has come to an end. This story makes you think, doesn't it? It strips the glossy varnish off history and shows its harsh and unseemly truth. But without this truth, we cannot understand the present. If this text hooked you, made you think, if you felt that pain and that chaos, do two simple things. First, subscribe to the channel, because such deep materials, breaking stereotypes, await you in the future. We will continue to analyze the most controversial and hushed-up topics in history. Second, write a comment. What do you feel after reading? Has your perception of the war changed? Do you agree that the problem was in the system and not in the tanks? Your opinion, your voice is very important. Let's discuss it together as thinking people. Write, argue, share your opinion, and don't forget to subscribe. It's the best thanks for our shared work. Until we meet again in the next investigations.